Unseen Life on Earth, Chapter 1, Identifying the Challenge. I'm going to give you a little background information that will augment what you read in the book or are going to read in the book, whichever the case may be. The book does talk about microorganisms, of course, in Chapter 1, but one of the things that they don't really spell out all that well, I don't believe, is the two different kinds of microorganisms that we're going to be learning about in this class. Some of them are what we call being prokaryotic organisms, and others are eukaryotic organisms. And there's a difference between those two, as the names imply. If you know your Latin roots, you know that pro means before. It means other things too. U means true. And the K-A-R-Y refers to a nucleus. You may not know what a nucleus is, but we'll learn about that a little bit in this class. So the prokaryotic organisms do not have a nucleus, nor do they have these little structures that we call organelles. Organelles are essentially little compartments that we find within the cells that do specific functions within the cells. We don't find those in the prokaryotic organisms. And so when we actually look at their structure, they're fairly simple. They've got a little part, something here, something there, maybe 5 or 6 different parts that you might need to learn, which is fairly simple, especially when we compare it to what we learn about eukaryotic organisms. Even though they are simple in structure, they are going to be very complicated in function. We can think about they have all the ability to use various energy sources, sugars, maybe your blood cells, that type of thing. So they are complicated in function. Eukaryotic organisms, on the other hand, do have a nucleus. And what we find in the nucleus is the DNA, in other words, the instructions that make the cell what it is. So in the prokaryotic organisms, the DNA is just kind of floating around inside the cell, but in the eukaryotic organisms, it's contained within a nucleus. We also are going to find organelles. I gave an example of one here that's called a mitochondria. That one's the powerhouse, the electrical substation, whatever you want to call it, that's going to actually power or make all of the energy that your cell is going to be using to do all of the reactions. Maybe not all of it, but certainly a large portion of it. When we get to looking at them, they are certainly complicated in structure, and if prokaryotic organisms are complicated in function, eukaryotic organisms are even more so. Okay. Now, there are some things that are common between prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms. I listed some different differences here, but there is an enzyme complex. It's called a ribosome. Both of these organisms have them. In fact, in order to be a living organism, you pretty much have to have ribosomes because they're going to make something called proteins, and proteins are doing a lot of work within the cell. But there are actually differences in the ribosomes between prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms. And that's going to come into play when we get to the chapter on controlling microorganisms, especially bacteria. The other thing is both of these organisms are going to have DNA, something in common, but there are some major differences between the DNA in a prokaryotic organism and a eukaryotic organism. So just to give you an image in your mind of a ribosome, here they're showing you a representation of a ribosome. They're showing you that it's made up of a couple of subunits, and they're showing you the small one here, and up here on top is a large one. And the way they show it, it doesn't look like the small is smaller, but it actually is. And then they're showing you this little beaded strand here that they're calling messenger RNA. Messenger RNA is bringing the information from the DNA to this ribosome, and then the ribosome is reading it, and it's going to bring in the amino acids to make the protein. Now, if you don't understand that, don't worry about it. We're actually going to cover that in more detail so that you'll have a better chance of understanding it when we get to a later chapter. And then the prokaryotic versus the eukaryotic DNA floating around inside the prokaryotic cell is going to be the DNA. And it's actually going to be in a circular form. Now, it doesn't look like a circle here, but there's a lot of DNA, so it kind of folds back up on itself, and gets all kind of twisty, but it's just really a circle. When you talk about eukaryotic DNA, it's actually linear, and they're showing you this representation of a chromosome where you can see that it's linear. And then there are various levels of complexity to it. This is how we typically represent a DNA strand. But then they're showing you these little proteins here. That's what they look like, little BBs here. They form little complexes and wrap around the DNA, and that helps the DNA to get very, very compact. So we have actually rather long pieces of DNA, and we have to get that all compacted into a small cell, and that's one way that they do it. Again, I'm going into a little more detail than you probably need to know for this chapter. Here's a simple representation of the prokaryotic versus eukaryotic organism. If you haven't picked up from the image, perhaps, the prokaryotic organisms are really the bacteria that we're going to be talking about. Some of the other microorganisms that we're going to talk about are going to fall into the eukaryotic realm. And then there's going to be some that are not, that are microorganisms, if you want to use that term, or things that we study, that won't be in either one of these. So here you can see ribosomes, and I defined what they are. They're an enzyme complex that are going to be making proteins by putting amino acids together. It's a fairly important function. And they are floating around here. They're showing you in the cytoplasm. They're showing you here an external structure on the bacteria that's called the flagellum. I like to think of it as an outboard motor. It helps the bacteria, kind of swim through the environment, sometimes to get towards something it wants to get to, and sometimes to get away from things. When we get to flagellum in microorganisms, we're going to see that some of them do have it, but probably not as common in eukaryotic organisms as we see in prokaryotic. Now, in this class, we're going to be using scientific names to describe a lot of these organisms. And what we typically use is what's called a binomial nomenclature. Big words there. Bi means two, nomial means name, so it's got two names. That's how we name them. And if you were to look at the grand scheme of things, we're using genus as the first name for the organism. And when we write it, we're always going to capitalize it. So when you hear about E. coli, the E is capitalized. That's actually short for the genus name of Escherichia. But we get lazy, or we make our life simple by abbreviating it. So here's an example organism named Bacillus, and you can see that I have capitalized it. Species is like the last name of the organism, and that one's always in lowercase letters. And one thing you have to watch out about when you're typing these names is that Microsoft Word has this lovely tendency if you're typing E. coli, you type capital E, period, space, then you type coli, and as soon as you hit the space after coli, it capitalizes coli because it thought that the period after the E was the end of the sentence, and it's correcting your mistake when actually it's making it wrong. Just a heads up. So the species name for one of these organisms, Bacillus, is Subtilis. And here I have it in all lowercase letters. Now, you may have picked up on the fact that I have these italicized right here. Everything else is in straight font, but they're italicized. And that is what we do in the scientific community, is a genus and species is going to be capitalized. Written in italicized font, capitalized genus in lowercase species. If you're writing it out by hand, which you won't really be doing and submitting, you would actually underline it. What you're trying to do is indicate that it is not a typically English word, or for any matter of any of the other languages that we have, that it is a scientific word, and that's how we denote that, is with the italics. And so there's the example. Now, in microbiology, we really stick hard and fast to that, and so just to let you know that in this class, if you don't do that, I am free to take points off of your assignment. Okay, so that's just something for you to keep in mind. Now, these microorganisms that we're going to be talking about, they're actually quite a huge range in size, maybe larger than you would normally think about. This one has a red blood cell, which I highlighted. It's not a microorganism, but it's a representative size. You may have seen a red blood cell under the microscope. You could certainly Google it, and you can see about how big it looks. And then we have this various other things in comparison. There is a microorganism that's called an amoeba. Some of these aren't bad. Some of them are. We don't like them, or they don't like us, whichever way you want it. They can cause us harm. But they are a lot bigger than the red blood cells. And these are really easy to see using a microscope. Using the light microscope, we can see these, they say coccus-shaped bacteria. It's represented here as a sphere, which is really what that word means. Coccus means spherical. We can also see rod-shaped bacteria, and that's what E. coli looks like. It looks like a sort of like a street Cheeto, if you want to describe it in food terms, so to speak. Now, these other things that I have listed down here are actually below the resolution of the light microscope. In other words, we can't see them if you were to go in the lab and use the microscopes that we have. You'd have to go to using an electron microscope, which is a lot more difficult to use, and so it's not typically used in the community college setting, or even a lot of colleges. And here we have viruses. We have polio, we have hepatitis, we have the AIDS virus. I threw in the pox virus as well. So this is where we start seeing the viruses, and we're going to be talking about that. And then way up here is this particular algae. Won't spend a lot of time on algae in this class, but there are some algae that produce toxins that can make a person sick. It can either be, make them sick in the stomach, it can give them neurological symptoms, any number of things. And so they can be good, they can be bad. And then up here in the range where we can see with the human eye, they're showing you the spores of a bread mold. And within the mold group, which is a member of the kingdom fungi, there are other fungi that are microscopic that we will actually be talking about. Yeast especially. Yeast is used for making bread or beer. That's going to be in that particular kingdom, the fungi, and we will be looking at that in this class as well. And that's the end for right now.